I'll introduce our panel in just a moment, but let me begin by saying that I think as we were discussing in the first panel about Iran, when we talk about the fate of minorities under repressive regimes, we understand, and I think ADL understands perhaps better than any individual among us, that the treatment of minorities is a bellwether for the liberty of society as a whole and for the state of civil liberties in a society as a whole. How a society treats its most marginalized, its most vulnerable, tells you how much it respects the equal human dignity of every person. And minority communities in the Middle East are uniquely vulnerable. And that means that those of us outside the region who seek to support them, who seek to support equality and dignity for minorities and for all people, in respecting that dignity, we have to listen. We have to take into account the voices from within those communities about their priorities, about their approaches, about their experiences, so that we can be most effective in the work that we seek to do. The virtue of liberal societies, of societies that enshrine liberal values, is not that we are perfect. None of us are perfect. The United States is not and has never been a society that perfectly recognizes the equality of every human. But the virtue of liberal societies is that they have the tools, they have the opportunities to correct, to improve, and to move toward better realization of equal human dignity. I think that as ADL pursues this important new initiative, it has tremendous partners on this task force who are true experts. And I'm grateful to all of them for their commitment of time to this enterprise.
As was said earlier, my name is Cristina Arriaga. I am Cuban American. My father fled Fidel Castro's Cuba because of his faith, and my mother is German. And she unfortunately was in a concentration camp in Germany before she left. She's not Jewish, but unfortunately was born in Leipzig at the wrong time. So I feel very personally about these issues. Being a Cuban German, I'm feisty yet organized. And I arrive on time to places. And I've been very lucky as a professional to be able to devote my life to the issues associated with human rights. Of course, my husband calls them conversation killers at cocktail parties, but I am very privileged that I've been able to work in this field of religious freedom. So I would like to start by asking my good friend Aykan Erdemir, my very learned friend. You just wrote recently a fascinating op-ed piece in which you said that the Erdogan regime for the last 16 years has done both gestures of benevolence, but also egregious scapegoating and persecutions of the exact same groups. And although from afar it may look like it's contrarian in some way, you said that these inconsistencies are actually a policy towards minorities that make it a coherent neo-Islamist strategy of instrumentalizing minorities. Can you talk a little bit more about this and what it means for minorities in Turkey and in the region? Thank you.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be on this panel, and also great to be moderated by one of my heroes who went all the way to Turkey, met Pastor Andrew Brunson in a Turkish prison, and thanks to her and her colleagues' efforts, after 2 years of unjust imprisonment, we have at least one of the hundreds of thousands unjustly harassed and persecuted in Turkey free, and hopefully there will be others to follow. What I call a neo-Islamist strategy is different from what we were used to, because Erdogan's mentor, the Islamist leader Erbakan, used to be pretty straightforward when it comes to Christians and Jews and infidels. What I think differentiates conventional Islamism from what I now call neo-Islamism is this current new trend of playing good cop, bad cop. I think current Islamists are very much aware that minorities are key to their overall governance strategy. So they have these spectacles of benevolence. For example, restoring a church, restoring a synagogue, attending a ceremony. But oftentimes there are built-in tensions. For example, Turkey has recently granted the Syriac Christian community the right to build a church. This is going to be the first church to be built from scratch in the Republican times. But they allocated a land which belongs to the Catholic community, thereby causing enormous tensions within the Christian community. And it was thanks to the intervention of the Pope himself the problem was solved. Or Erdogan restored a Bulgarian Orthodox church, and he inaugurated it during the first week of Bulgaria's European Union term presidency. So this was kind of asking for favors from Bulgaria. And meanwhile, in the Islamist press, they said that the church was restored, but only in exchange for Bulgaria to build a mosque someplace else. Or Erdogan says, I will allow the Halki Seminary, which is the one big seminary where Orthodox priests are trained, which is currently closed. He said, I will open it, but only if you build a mosque in Athens in exchange. And the best response to this comes from a Turkish Christian who once said, we're not hostages to be bartered. I think that's the sentiment. Neo-Islamist politics instrumentalizes minorities. It scapegoats them, smears them, persecutes them at times, often for domestic political gain. It basically distracts the voters from the mismanagement of the government itself and points the finger to the minorities, to what they call the fifth columns. But at other times, it shamelessly exploits them for either extracting concessions, especially from Western countries, or for bartering privileges elsewhere. And overall, I think the end result is an erosion, a systematic erosion of the notion of equal citizenship, equality before law. All of these are enshrined in the Turkish constitution. Turkey is legally, constitutionally a secular state where all citizens, regardless of their faith, should be treated the same, but we don't see that. There isn't a single non-Sunni Muslim who is appointed one of the 81 governors in Turkey. There is not a single non-Sunni Muslim police chief in one of the 81 provinces in Turkey. Turkish diplomatic corps is exclusively Muslim, and which is pretty much the same all across Turkey's top bureaucracy. So there is a systematic discrimination against not only non-Muslims, but also against Alevis and Shia. You have to be Sunni to be one of the in crowd in Turkey. But I think what makes things even worse is, besides this instrumentalization, is the transnational aspect. And I think that would pave the way to my colleagues' interventions, because some of you might have seen on YouTube The Last Emperor, which is a state-funded historical drama, which is a revisionist drama, which tells a completely fabricated historical account of the final century of the Ottoman Empire and argues that it was all a Jewish, Christian, Freemason conspiracy that brought down the empire. And we have documented how this drama, which is now available with subtitles in Spanish and English, and it's intoxicating the entire Muslim majority world. And it basically argues that because of all these conspiracies, not only the Ottoman Empire, but Islam itself is at risk. And we have seen, documented the ways in which immediately after following this historical, quote-unquote, historical drama, people took to Twitter and started making violent threats against Turkey's religious minorities. Just to give you one example, one user said, "The more I watch The Last Emperor, the more my hatred toward Jews increase." Another one said, "I will turn the territory between the Euphrates River and the Niles River into a Jewish graveyard." So this is incitement that has immediate effect. And we have seen indeed a spike in the attacks targeting Turkey's churches and synagogues. So I think this is the new threat, the new landscape of threat that we're facing. First of all, a more ambivalent neo-Islamist regime, which plays good cop and bad cop with minorities, and at the same time, a deterritorialized neo-Islamist regime. That is, a regime that uses new media, social media, state-funded TV channels, and high-tech production capability to reach not only to its own citizens, but also across the world, across the globe, to inculcate hate, prejudice, and intolerance toward minorities.
Thank you very much. I lost the button for a second, sorry. That's the previous panel, someone said that Iran was an analog dictatorship, which I thought was very interesting. Given the fact that Turkey is both analog and digitally advanced, Sam Tadros, what are the dynamics that play into the narrative that has been created in the Middle East that transcends the borders of all the countries we are dealing with? Thank you.
Thank you for having me on the panel and for including me in this task force, which I think is filling a very important vacuum that's here. Only ADL is, in a sense, positioned to raise this issue, and only ADL can create such a bipartisan group of people from different backgrounds to take this issue seriously outside of the political divisions. I must say first on Turkey that I did watch part of the series. It was shared.
Was it good? I mean, is it worth watching?
I mean, it was shared by Arabic-speaking friends, and I found it remarkable that after they did one on Muhammad the Conqueror, after Suleiman the Magnificent, now he's reached the level of Abdul Hamid. I mean, if he wants the comparison to Abdul Hamid, I'd be happy to include him in that comparison to a failed ruler of a collapsing state. But let me go back and to a story from the shores of Libya. In February 2015 was that image from the ISIS video, the Islamic State video of the beheading of 20 Copts and one Ghanaian on that shore in the beach in Libya. And the video received, obviously, a lot of people saw it and were shocked by it, by the courage of the men that they showed at that moment. But the story doesn't stop at the shores of Libya. It continues afterwards. Egypt's president, shocked by the event, both ordered a military strike on Libya. It targeted another city, not where they were killed, but that's just details. But more importantly, ordered the building of a church in the village where 13 of them had come from to honor their memory. It would be called the Church of the Martyrs of the country. The initiative was much welcomed in a country where the building of churches is extremely problematic. I remember as a young kid, not only how building churches was hard, but even building bathrooms next to churches. I remember my grandfather and elders of the Coptic community in our village signing this request for a presidential decree, because you had to get President Mubarak to do it, to give us a bathroom so that we can, yes, use the bathroom while we're going for these 2-hour, 3-hour liturgies in church. I try not to think of Mubarak while using that bathroom. But that was a welcome initiative by President Sisi. But the story doesn't stop here. In the month after that attack, after Sisi had promised that church, a mob started to gather in the village of Al-Or. The mob twice, on the 20th of March and then on the 27th, attacked the houses of churches, the shops that, the houses of Christians, sorry, the shops that they owned, with Molotov cocktails, with stones. No one was killed in those attacks, but the community that has just suffered such a remarkable attack in the form of the loss in Libya was pained once again by the rejection of not some terrorists in a faraway country, but by their very neighbors, people that they live with on a daily basis and deal with, of their simple rejection of a church being built in that village. To complicate the story further, the security forces, once they arrived on the scene, did not punish the perpetrators. Instead, they decided to hold a reconciliation session. In more than 1,000 attacks on the Christian community in Egypt that have happened since the 70s until today, not one of these attacks done by the mob, it's very different when it's the terrorists, the ones the government is already fighting, doing these attacks, but when it's a mob attack, not in one of these cases have they been brought to a court of law. Instead, the reconciliation session gets the elders of both communities and the representatives of the state security in the area, the member of parliament, the governor maybe, the mayor of that village, and they gather and they decide on basically the terms of surrender. You see, no one is going to be punished. It's going to create a culture of impunity. You can attack the Christians and get away with it. But it's also going to create a culture of encouragement. Because if you guys are objecting to, say, a church being built, we're not going to build a church. Or we're going to build a church under certain conditions. It's going to have no tower, no dome, no cross on top of it. It won't have any sign that it is, no bells, nothing that indicates it's a church. We don't accept the public manifestation of Christianity in our village. Now, here was the problem. The president of Egypt himself had ordered that church to be built. The local governor, who just 2 weeks earlier had done exactly that in a village next to Al-Or called the Galet, by denying the Christians who had submitted a request for a church for over 15 years that request, in that case, he couldn't deny it. But at the same time, he couldn't completely give the Christians what they wanted, the church they had been promised. So the solution for him was, we're going to keep the president's word, we're going to build the church outside of the village outskirts. By that, the mob had been appeased and the president's word had been kept. This story really captures the kind of challenges that religious minorities face in the region, because they don't come just from one actor. They come from the interaction, the relationship, the dynamic between these three different actors. Between Islamist groups, whether they are of the jihadi type who did the killing on that beach in Libya, or they're of the non-violent or the Muslim Brotherhood type, which engage in intolerant discourse, in incitement against the Christians on a constant basis. It is the second actor, the governments, whose policies discriminate against these religious minorities, whether it's in terms of building churches or in appointments in government positions or in even teaching their existence and history, where Egyptian history has this magical gap of 300 years where nothing basically happened between the Romans and when the Arab Muslim armies arrived in the country. And it is increasingly that of the challenge from an intolerant society. And that, perhaps, is the greatest of all challenges. Because if terrorist groups can be fought and defeated, if persecuting tyrants can be bought off or international pressure used to make them stop their persecution, the hardest thing is to deal with hatred when it's taken over people's hearts and minds, when the people that you go to school with, that you work with, that you ride the bus with, are the very people attacking you and throwing a Molotov cocktail on your home.
Thank you so much. So we see in Turkey there is this treatment of minorities that are encouraging a certain narrative that is being perpetuated in television programs. And then, of course, now we see a situation where the government is not willing, perhaps not capable of making sure that these communities can come to an understanding without impunity. This, at USERV, we oftentimes say these countries are in a bad neighborhood. So I was very inspiring to hear the story of Shadi Martini, who has started a program called The Good Neighborhood.
Not me, the IDF, but we were working.
Oh,
I don't claim credit for that.
Well, I'll give you credit. Many of your friends disappeared or were tortured, and you never heard from them again. And you leave the country, and then you come back into the country, forging partnerships with your neighbors who were not your friends at the time. So can you tell us a little bit about that initiative and how you were able to forge unity among people who had disliked each other for hundreds of years and for many generations?
Well,
Thank you.
Thank you for the question. And I want to start to give a background about how this hatred has infested our communities. Like Sam said, it's your neighbor, it's your countryman, it's your brother. So we're from a generation that didn't have internet, didn't have cell phones. Our only sources for information were state media. For instance, talking about Syria, we had only one TV channel that's very much monitored. We had 3 official newspapers. If you read one, you know what's in the other 2. Same information, copy-paste. Our libraries were very much monitored. If you had information and you want to know if it's true, you will go and see the likes books of the protocols of the elders of Zion. You will have other books that, for instance, about Jews' traditions of butchering kids in Damascus so they can mix their bread and eat them. Such books were widespread and believed as truthful. And there was no one to argue against that. I'm from a city that had, for instance, it's called Aleppo or Halab, it's in Arabic. It's a very vibrant Jewish community, which is a very prominent Halabi community. I didn't know about that. My only memory was seeing 7 kids in my school that came and were isolated, and we thought, who are they? Then they told us they're Jews. And we were all afraid to go and talk to them because we might be labeled as traitors, because they're Israeli spies and you don't touch them. So they were isolated by themselves, and after a month, they disappeared. No one wanted to know where they are. We were relieved. They were gone. So this is how we were brought up. So it was very hard for us to understand the anxiety of minority and the anxiety of people who had to flee Syria. At the same time, the government in Syria is unique. It's governed by a family that's actually from a minority. The majority of Syria is Muslim Sunni Arabs, and the president of Syria and his father was from the Alawi community, which is about 10 to 13%. The issue is the president is using tensions between minorities, anxieties of certain minorities, and playing minority against each other. For an example, the government in Syria will give the Armenian community the right to talk, to teach their language, to write their language. At the same time, another ethnic minority, which is Syrian and in the land for thousands of years, the Kurdish minority were deprived of speaking their language. They weren't given citizenship on the basis that they are foreign people who came into Syria. And we didn't know, we always thought that Syria existed in this political term for thousands of years. But Syria, in fact, it's 100 years old in this political format, but as a geographic term, of course, it's old, but it was always part of the Ottoman Empire, of the Muslim Empire, or other empires, the Roman Empire. So playing this card of putting minorities against each other, scaring some minorities of the majority, if it's going to rule, it's going to butcher you, and to preserve its rule. And it's a tactic that is used by a lot of leaders in the region. For me personally, when I was living in Syria and managing a hospital, it was very hard for me to get information, even when the internet was introduced. For instance, let me give you an example. In 2009, I was managing a hospital, and I was trying to download a medical file. And 2009, I had to use dial-up. I don't know if a lot of you know what dial-up is. But it was so funny that the same year I watched a movie called, I think, The Proposal, Sandra Bullock was played, and her role was she went into this town in the US, and they gave her coins, and she she heard this sound, and she said, "What's that?" And it said, "It's dial-up." So what's dial-up? That's 2009. And I was looking at it, well, this is my life. It took me like 15 minutes to download this file, a medical file, so I can check it. So that was the life we lived in. Facebook was banned. I had to use a proxy to get on my account. So this is the backdrop of my story. This is how I witnessed what's happening in Syria and the persecution of people. And I was trying to help communities who were under siege, who were deprived of medical attention. And then I had to flee Syria. And then all of a sudden, a group of people come to me and that tells me, "We want to help you." And I was like, "Fine, good." But they say, "Oh, well, but we are from Israel. Would you accept our help?" And that's all this hatred and all these teaching came flashback to me. And the first question I asked myself, why do you want to help me? And the second question I asked them, are you Mossad? Because there's no reason for you to help me if you don't want something from us, information. And they told me, well, look, Mossad already knows everything about Syria, so I don't think we want anything from you. We have our satellites, we have our spies, so I don't think you're the one to provide this. So it was a very eye-opening for me as a person, and from that moment, I start to understand the anxieties of others and other people's suffering, coming from a Muslim background, I'm from an Arab background, and the way I was taught and not questioning whatever I was taught, it was a very opening experience that I faced. But unfortunately, a lot of people in the Middle East didn't have this experience. And from that moment, we started working and it developed to provide this aid through Israel into Syria, where we brought, Israelis and Syrians together to find a platform to help each other and take away this animosity and look about the humanitarian work and leave their politics aside. And what we try to do all the time, because when on our task force, we always try to say what's the problems in the area, but at the same time, we try to tell people that things can change. We need to engage. There's a lot of misinformation. There's a lot of hatred being fueled by political actors to gain power. And it's our responsibility to bring these communities together and build these bridges. And we give them the case that we did between arch enemies, Syrians and Israelis, arch enemies, in religious perspective, Jews and Muslims in this region. And we're doing the same thing in the Kurdistan region of Iraq, and we're doing the same thing in northeastern Syria, where areas have been liberated from ISIS. And it's very important to bring the communities, Arabs and Kurds, Christian and Muslims, to have a stable society so they can flourish. Because at the end of the day, if we want a church to be rebuilt, you need community to preserve this church. So if they don't have stability, if they don't have the opportunity, you can build a church and it will stay empty. This is not our aim. For me as a Syrian, I was so saddened to learn of the rich history of our Jewish communities that just disappeared. And I don't want to see this replicated with the Christian community, with the Kurdish community, with different communities from we have like 34 sects in Syria and religious and ethnic difference groups. So I would love this richness to stay in Syria because I feel it's a powerful thing and enrich our life. And this is what actually this task force is trying to do. We're trying to highlight what brings us together and give a positive story that things can get better if we work together across religious and ethnic lines.
Thank you so much. And thank you for the task force because, as you said, things can change. Commissioner, my fellow Commissioner Moore, do you know what a dial-up is? Because you're so young. He's one of the few bios where he says Johnny Moore, 35. And I'm like, maybe I should be writing Christina Arriaga, 54. Well, I think then I would be in 3 different EOC categories. But anyway, I digress. I remember when I grew up in a Roman Catholic country in Puerto Rico, I had never met a Protestant. So when I came to the United States and to go to college, someone said, that person's a Protestant. And I remember staring at them, walking down as if something would happen. So many of us have had similar experiences. But there's a lot of bad news, but there's also good news. Can you tell us what you think? Can things change in this region of the world?
Well, I mean, maybe it is precisely because I am a millennial that I'm slightly more optimistic. It's the best of times and it's the worst of times, in my estimation, for religious freedom around the world, and there are lots of reasons why, and I'll get to that in just a second. But there are wonderful things to be optimistic about. I mean, you can go country by country, and when you look at the fact that the Pope himself visited the Arabian Peninsula. I mean, this is incomprehensible. I mean, on the peninsula of Mecca and Medina, I happened to be there for the visit. It was 100,000 plus people that gathered for this. And what was even more interesting is that upon the Pope's visit, I mean, he was Pope Francis. He was prophetic in what he said. He wasn't entirely complimentary, to the region, and yet, there was this maturity, in the way the Emiratis hosted him, and there was no effort to diminish it. And by the way, there was a gigantic golden cross behind him the whole time in the stadium. And what was interesting to me is the morning that I woke up and he arrived, I immediately went over and I looked at the Saudi papers, because I've been to Saudi Arabia now twice in the last several months. And what was amazing is when you actually saw the papers throughout the region, I mean, whether they were in Arabic or in English, the Pope was on the front of them. And in one of the papers, I mean, there was an editorial above the fold on the front page which speculated whether the Pope himself would visit the kingdom, on his next visit. So there's an argument to be made about, the degree to which these steps are symbolic or substantive. But when you're doing things like bringing the Pope himself to the Arabian Peninsula, this means something. In Egypt, the Egyptian government has massive challenges with the Copts in certain parts of the country, as my friend Sam has articulated so well. On the same token, this is the year that the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar said to our very commission in a meeting that the Baha'i ought to have their own places of worship and the Jehovah's Witnesses ought to have their own places of worship. He said it, standing outside of the grand opening of the Coptic Cathedral in the new capital city. I happen to also be a witness of that, and the Grand Imam standing there with the Coptic Pope. Said, and the Egyptian president, for that matter, said outright that every Jew in the country ought to have a synagogue and every Christian in the country ought to have a church. And a few weeks later, I mean, we see the largest Jewish cemetery in the entire part of the world, being the beginning processes of restoring it. So there are these very, very clear movements in the region. You can go to Bahrain. Bahrain, again, all these countries have their challenges, but I think we have to give credit where credit is due, and we have to be an equal opportunity critic. And in Bahrain, the King of Bahrain, the Bahrain Declaration, is the first such document in the entire Arab world that calls for the freedom of choice when it comes to religion. I mean, people are willing to have a dialogue about religious freedom, but to be able to explicitly put in writing that you can make a choice, about your religion is something significant. And even in Saudi Arabia, I mean, there are no words to describe the horrific actions of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia when it comes to the suppression of religious minorities. There are no words to describe what happened just last weekend. On the same token, the Minister of Islamic Affairs of the country, who was the previously was involved in the religious police, was involved in reforming the religious police. We as commissioners, had the had the opportunity to meet with the religious police in Saudi Arabia for the first time. We've never been allowed to do that. They've taken the religious police off the streets. They've taken away their arrest powers. The Minister of Islamic Affairs has now said in 2 meetings, that I've been in, that Saudi Arabia is no longer a kingdom where there can only be one religion. It just outright says it. You see the actions of the General, Secretary of the World Muslim League wandering around the world, going to Holocaust museums and writing editorials about Auschwitz, and the Washington Post. I mean, the World Muslim League was principally responsible for exporting Wahhabist ideas, right? So there are lots of positive actions taking place in the region. So we ask why. Well, in this informed audience, some of those reasons are obvious, right? It's shared interest, of course, as it relates to Iran and other national security interest. By the way, my favorite phrase when it comes to the Middle East is, it's all true. All the time. My second favorite phrase when it comes to the Middle East is, the most valuable commodity in the Middle East is not oil or gas, it's trust. That's what's most valuable. And when you sit down and you have direct engagement with these leaders, whether it has to do with shared interest, there also is a movement towards shared values. And that's where I think it's important that we recognize that the disruptions in the region provide a space for a type of engagement we've never seen before. And we need to take full advantage of this opportunity for all of the reasons that it exists in order to shimmy open the door that has been cracked to us. And so I actually believe that we could see a different Middle East if we engage in the right way at the right time with the right leaders. Who knows what could happen?
Excellent. Thank you so much. Oftentimes, Washington, D.C. is called, I've heard a friend call it Hollywood for the ugly, a place where people are famous depending on their power, right? And I oftentimes, when I speak to groups, experience a little bit of Middle East fatigue, like, yes, it's all true. And I'm always reminded of when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was drafted, and Article 18, which refers to freedom of religion or belief, was drafted. Charles Malik, who was a Lebanese Orthodox Christian, once said, freedom of religion is not about being, it's about becoming. It's about the freedom to become something better. Since you're all part of this new creation that's fantastic for ADL, if you think of the Middle East in terms of becoming in 1 minute or less, what do you see it becoming, and how do you see it getting there? What would be the one key factor that you think would take the Middle East to where it wants and needs to go in order to protect its minorities fully? So if you don't mind, I'll start in reverse. Commissioner Moore?
Well, I think we have a realistic view of what can change. And so the way I like to think of it is concentric circles. My goal as an advocate for reform is to get as much done in the circle I have and expect the circle to expand, but not to spend all my energy expanding the circle, right? So what are the little steps that can take place to bring reform? And I think it's different in every country. In the Islamic world, in places like the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, it would be nice for there to at least be a level of religious pluralism like existed when the Prophet Muhammad himself was, there in geography. In Egypt, as we've said in our USERF report this year, the Egyptian government just needs to do 2 things. They need to address Minya, and whether they have the resources or the capability of doing it. Number 2, the Baha'i. The government has said something. The religious institutions are supportive of it. Like, just solve the problem. There's an order the president can reverse. There's a special office that can be created to address issues like marriage. Those are two examples. We could go country by country. But rather than saying a religious freedom environment that looks like the United States, I think we need these little accessible steps, step by step, and then things will change. Trust will be built. The peer pressure will be in the right direction. Sorry, I went over a minute, Shadi.
It's fine. Well, I think there is some ways that governments can do specific things to change, but I think it's a gradual change, because the problem is you need to change the population so we don't have these problems. And I see the major issue of education is something very critical in the Middle East. Education is something a lot of governments teach hate in their curriculum. And also, another thing that I believe it's lacking in the Middle East, we have a lot of religion, but we have few absence of morality. So that's also a very important thing. And when you have good education, good moral values, I think gradually people will change, and I feel everyone will feel safe. Not only minorities, they will feel safe that this is their country, and they want to do something to improve their country. But that's something on the long run that we need to invest, and we need to convince leaders that they need to invest in for the better of their country and their own future, political future, and their future generation.
Maybe 2 or 3 years ago, an Egyptian journalist by the name of Caroline Kamel wrote an article that created an uproar in the country. She had just gotten engaged, and a colleague of hers, a Muslim female, asked her, I've had this question I've always wanted to ask any of my Christian friends, was never close enough to someone to ask it. Where's your husband going to spend the first night? Confused, the journalist replied, well, what, you think he's going to run away from me from the first day? No, I mean, where really is he going? Where's he going to be when the priest is with you? Her Muslim colleague, a journalist working in a newspaper, graduate of journalism school in an Egyptian university, thought that every Christian girl, the priest gets the right of first night. The article created an uproar because of people's comments, who not only shared that, yes, they too had thought that was a Christian practice, but shared other ideas that they had. Coptic priests wore black because they were sad that Islam dominated Egypt. All of these conspiracy theories and ideas that people had. Now, of course, if you want to know where they got the idea, you have Mel Gibson to thank. It's Braveheart. They thought that what was depicted in the movie, the British practice with the Scottish girl, must be a Christian practice. That's what they all do. In the absence of actual knowledge about the rich mosaic diversity of the communities of the Middle East, that absence, that emptiness cannot remain forever while you're dealing on a daily basis with these people. And when there is no facts, it's only filled with conspiracy theories and misinformation. If I would change one thing, it would be to introduce that rich history, to teach Egyptian kids, whether they're Christian or Muslim, about the Coptic history of Egypt, about taking pride that it is in Egypt that monasticism was invented, that all these monks and nuns around the world follow this crazy Egyptian guy in the 4th century, 3rd century, St. Anthony, and that's how the whole thing started. I would teach them actual facts instead of those wrong ideas.
In a lightning round, when you're the last one to speak, you have to end on a note of hope. And I would like to emphasize the role transnationalism plays in minority rights and religious freedoms. First of all, the bad news is it exacerbates the threats, right? From Islamic State to Al-Qaeda 2.0 to illiberal ideologies in the Middle East, we see a transnational cooperation among bigots and murderers and persecutors, which makes our challenge much greater. But at the same time, I think the the new level and nature of threat has awakened us to the fact that our response can no longer be within our own communities, within our own nation states, within our own political factions. It has to be as transnational as the perpetrators. We have to be as resourceful as they are. We have to be as committed as they are. We have to be as outreaching as they are. And I think this is the message of hope, that we have learned a lesson the hard way, with a lot of tears and blood, but I think we are ready to begin a new chapter. I see ADL's task force, which brings a very diverse group of individuals together, as a testimony to that. I see the International Panel of Parliamentarians for Freedom of Religion or Belief as another testimony to that. Since our launch in 2014, we have reached 97 countries, over 300 lawmakers from around the world, Christians, Jews, Muslims, atheists, agnostics, Buddhists, Hindus, but more importantly, left-wing, right-wing, centrists, people who are advocates of same-sex marriage, people who refuse to recognize same-sex marriage. It doesn't matter. The issue is, when it comes to Article 18, when it comes to religious freedom issues, despite our differences, we have all pledged to, first, listen to one another, second, build joint platforms, and third, work, struggle. If possible, win together. If not possible, lose it this time around, and next time we'll fail better.